The silverware clinked against porcelain plates with that particular rhythm that only comes from expensive dinnerware and practiced hands. I stood in the archway between the kitchen and dining room, neither fully in nor out, watching my family settle into their assigned places around the mahogany table my father had commissioned from a craftsman in Seattle. The autumn light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Pearl District home, casting everything in that golden hour glow that photographers chase. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My mother adjusted the centerpiece, white lilies and eucalyptus arranged just so, while my father poured wine into crystal glasses that caught the light like small prisms. My younger brother Dylan sat at the head of the table opposite our father, his laptop still open beside his plate, probably reviewing the presentation he'd given to the firm's biggest client that morning. Nobody had asked me to sit yet. That was fine. I'd learned to wait. The invitation had come 3 days earlier, my mother's voice tied over the phone with that particular strain that meant she was calling out of obligation rather than desire. Thanksgiving dinner. 6 o'clock sharp. Don't be late this time. I almost didn't come. The last family dinner had ended with my father's silent treatment lasting through dessert and my mother's pointed questions about when I planned to do something real with my life. But something told me this time would be different, though not in any way I could have anticipated. I smoothed down the front of my thrift store button-down, acutely aware of how it contrasted with Dylan's tailored suit and my father's custom-fitted blazer. My mother glanced at me, her eyes doing that quick assessment she'd perfected over the years, cataloging everything that didn't measure up. Her lips pressed together in that thin line that said more than words ever could. The thing about being the family disappointment is that you start to feel it in your bones before anyone says a word. It's in the way conversations pause when you enter a room, then restart with just a shade less enthusiasm. It's in the seating arrangements at holiday dinners, where somehow you always end up at the far end, next to the cousin nobody wants to talk to or the empty chair reserved for latecomers. It's in the way your achievements, no matter how hard won, get measured against someone else's and found wanting. For the Bennett family, success had always been spelled out in clear terms. My grandfather had built a small construction company into something respectable. My father had elevated it further, pivoting into high-end architectural design, creating the kind of modern homes that appeared in Portland Monthly and Dwell magazine. Bennett and Associates wasn't just a firm anymore. It was a legacy, a brand, a promise that whatever the Bennetts touched turned to something valuable and visible. Dylan had understood this from birth, or so it seemed. At 26, he'd already made junior partner, his designs winning awards, his name appearing in the same trade publications that had once featured our father's work. He spoke the language of load-bearing walls and sustainable materials, of client acquisition and profit margins. He fit into the family narrative like a puzzle piece cut specifically for that space. I had tried to fit that same space once. I'd enrolled at Reed College with a major in economics, telling myself I could learn the business side of things, maybe bring something valuable to the firm. My father had nodded approvingly when I'd announced my plans, the first time I'd seen pride in his eyes in years. My mother had actually hugged me, whispering that it was good to see me finally getting serious about my future. I lasted 3 semesters before the walls started closing in. The theories felt hollow, disconnected from anything that mattered. While my classmates debated supply curves and market equilibrium, I kept thinking about the tent city I passed every day on my way to campus, the families living under tarps and blankets, the kids doing homework by flashlight. The numbers in my textbooks represented people, but somewhere in all the abstraction the people had disappeared. The day I walked into the campus housing advocacy meeting changed everything. They were organizing students to pressure the city council about zoning laws that made it nearly impossible to build affordable housing. The woman leading the meeting was Elena Vasquez, though I didn't know her name yet. She spoke with the kind of quiet intensity that made you lean forward in your seat, laying out facts and figures that actually meant something. She talked about families, about displacement, about how the city's growth was pushing out the very people who'd built its neighborhoods. After the meeting, I stayed behind to help fold chairs. Elena asked me what I was studying. When I told her economics, she'd laughed, not unkindly, and said that was either the best or worst preparation for this kind of work, depending on whether I was willing to unlearn half of what they taught me. I started volunteering that week. Just a few hours at first, making phone calls, organizing data, showing up at city council meetings to hold signs and add my voice to the crowd. But those few hours expanded like water finding cracks in concrete. I'd skip a class to help canvass a neighborhood. Then I'd miss a whole day to drive supplies to a family who'd just been evicted. My grades started slipping, not catastrophically, but enough that my academic advisor sent a concerned email. The real breaking point came during finals week of my third semester. Elena called me at 2 in the morning. There was a family, she said. A mother with 3 kids. Being locked out of their apartment despite having a legal stay from the housing authority. The landlord was doing it anyway, betting they wouldn't know their rights or have the resources to fight back. She needed someone who could be there in 20 minutes with a camera and a cool head. I went. I documented everything. I stayed with that family until 7 in the morning when the legal aid office opened, and we could get an emergency injunction. Then I went home, slept for 3 hours and missed my macroeconomics final. I could have explained it to my professors, could have gotten an incomplete and made up the work. But sitting in my apartment that afternoon, exhausted and wired on bad coffee, I realized I didn't want to. The exam questions felt like they were written in a language I no longer spoke. The theories and models seemed designed to explain why things were the way they were, not to change them into what they could be. I withdrew from Reed the next week, walked into the registrar's office and signed the papers that made it official. The woman processing my withdrawal asked if I was sure, mentioned something about taking a leave of absence instead, keeping my options open. I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Telling my parents was harder. I'd practiced the conversation in my head a dozen times, trying to find words that would help them understand. I wanted to explain about the family I'd helped, about the work Elena was doing, about how I'd found something that felt real and urgent and necessary. But when I actually sat down across from my father in his home office, surrounded by architectural renderings and awards, the words came out wrong. I'm leaving school, I'd said. I found other work that matters more. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture. My father set down the pen he'd been holding with exaggerated care. My mother, who'd been standing in the doorway, made a small sound that might have been a gasp or might have been something breaking. What work? My father finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. Community development, I'd said. Affordable housing advocacy. There's a nonprofit that needs someone to coordinate between the legal team and the families they're helping. My father's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. That's not work, Marcus. That's volunteering. That's something you do on weekends, not instead of an education. It pays, I protested, though we both knew the salary Elena had offered was barely above minimum wage. My mother stepped fully into the room then, her hands twisting together. We paid for Reed, she said. We invested in your future. And you're throwing it away for what? To be a social worker? The way she said social worker made it sound like a disease. The argument that followed carved out new territory in our family's landscape of disappointment. My father wanted to know what I planned to do for a real career. My mother cried about wasted potential and poor decisions. Dylan, who'd been called in for reinforcement, tried the reasonable approach, suggesting I could volunteer while finishing my degree, as if I were a child who needed help understanding basic time management. Nobody asked why. Nobody wanted to know what I'd seen or learned or felt. The conversation was only about what I was giving up, never about what I might be gaining. I moved out 2 weeks later, finding a studio apartment in a building that had seen better days, where the radiator clanked and the windows didn't quite seal against the winter cold. My parents helped me move with the kind of preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Of grim efficiency usually reserved for funerals, my mother's lips pressed into that thin line, my father's jaw set in stone. When they left, my mother hugged me with the desperation of someone saying goodbye to a terminal patient. That was 8 years ago. In the time since, I'd become a ghost at family gatherings, present but not really there, spoken about in the third person even when I was in the room. The narrative had solidified into something unshakable. Marcus had dropped out of college. Marcus was wasting his potential. Marcus was working some nonprofit job that barely paid rent. Marcus was the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you didn't stick with the plan. At Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations, I sat at my designated spot and listened to updates about Dylan's latest project, his promotion, his new condo in the trendy part of town. I watched my parents beam with pride, their success reflected and multiplied in their younger son. And when the conversation occasionally turned to me, usually prompted by some well-meaning aunt or family friend, my father would clear his throat and say something about how I was still finding my path, his tone suggesting that the path was more likely a dead end. I let them believe it because the truth was too complicated and because my work required a certain amount of invisibility. The families I helped didn't need to know that I came from money, or that my father's firm had probably designed some of the luxury developments that had displaced them. The developers I negotiated with didn't need to know that I understood their language, that I'd been trained to see the world through their eyes before I learned to see it differently. And my colleagues at the nonprofit didn't need to know that every family dinner felt like a small death, that I went home afterward and sat in the dark, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But I had made the right choice. I knew that in my bones the same way I'd once felt my family's disappointment. In 8 years I'd helped secure housing for over 300 families. I'd worked with Elena and a team of lawyers to change zoning ordinances that had kept affordable housing out of a dozen neighborhoods. I'd sat across from landlords and developers and city officials, learning their pressure points, finding the cracks in their arguments, building coalitions that turned impossible into inevitable. The work didn't come with awards or magazine features. Nobody wrote articles about the late nights spent reviewing housing codes, or the tedious hours of community meetings. Success looked like a single mother getting her security deposit back, or a family avoiding eviction, or a new apartment complex breaking ground with 30% of units reserved for low-income residents. It was granular and grinding and absolutely essential. I became good at living two lives that never quite touched. In one I was Marcus Bennett, the dropout, the disappointment, the son who'd squandered his opportunities. In the other I was the person Elena called at midnight when a crisis hit, the one developers grudgingly respected across negotiation tables, the coordinator who could translate between legal language and the raw desperation of families about to lose everything. The apartment I lived in told the story my family believed. It was small, with pipes that groaned in winter and neighbors whose arguments bled through thin walls. I drove a 15-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door, and a check engine light that had been on so long I'd stopped noticing it. My clothes came from thrift stores or clearance racks, functional but years behind whatever was current. When my mother visited once, exactly once, she'd looked around with barely concealed horror, her gaze lingering on the second-hand furniture and the kitchen with its chipped linoleum. "This is where you live," she'd said, not quite a question. "This is where I live," I'd confirmed. She'd left after 20 minutes, citing traffic, though we both knew the Pearl District was only 15 minutes away. She didn't come back. What my family never saw was the filing cabinet in my bedroom closet, stuffed with documentation of every case I'd worked. They didn't know about the laptop where I tracked housing legislation across 3 counties, or the relationships I'd built with city council members and nonprofit directors. They'd never sat in on the meetings where developers initially laughed at our proposals, then slowly realized we had the legal standing and community support to make their lives difficult if they didn't negotiate. They definitely didn't know about the families. There was Maria, who'd been living in her car with her 2 daughters after their apartment building was sold to a developer who wanted everyone out. I'd spent 6 weeks finding her emergency housing, then permanent placement in a renovated building where rent was tied to income. Her oldest daughter was in high school now, talking about college, something that wouldn't have been possible if they'd stayed in that car. There was James, a veteran with PTSD who'd been cycling through the shelter system, until we found him a studio in a building specifically designed for people with mental health needs, with on-site support services and a landlord who actually understood trauma-informed care. He'd been stable there for 4 years now, working part-time at a bike shop, rebuilding a life that had been shattered. There was the Chun family, restaurant workers who'd been served an illegal eviction notice by a landlord banking on them, not knowing their rights. I'd connected them with legal aid, documented everything, and watched their case become precedent that protected dozens of other families in similar situations. These were the stories I carried but never told at family dinners. How do you explain that kind of work to people who measure success in square footage and profit margins? How do you make them understand that preventing a disaster nobody sees is just as important as building something everyone notices? The disconnect became almost philosophical over time. My father built structures that lasted, visible monuments to design and engineering. I tried to keep people from losing the structures they already had. Invisible work that succeeded when nothing dramatic happened at all. Both were necessary, but only one got recognized at Chamber of Commerce dinners. Elena understood, though. She'd been doing this work for 15 years by the time I stumbled into that campus meeting, long enough to have her own scars from family members who didn't get it. Her parents had wanted her to go to law school, use her undergraduate degree to make real money at a corporate firm. Instead, she'd gone into housing advocacy, learned landlord-tenant law through necessity and night classes, built a nonprofit from nothing into something that actually moved policy. She became the mentor I hadn't known I needed, not just teaching me the technical aspects of housing law and community organizing, but showing me how to sustain yourself in work that constantly felt like pushing against a river. She taught me to celebrate the small victories because they were the only kind we'd get most of the time. She showed me how to sit with families in crisis without absorbing all their pain, how to be present without drowning. "You're good at this," she told me after I'd successfully negotiated my first major case, getting a landlord to make repairs they'd been avoiding for months. "You see the systems and the people at the same time. That's rare." I'd felt something shift in my chest at those words, a kind of recognition I'd been starving for. My family might not understand what I did, but Elena did, and so did the families whose lives improved because of this work. Maybe that could be enough. The years accumulated like sediment, each one adding another layer to the person I was becoming. I learned to navigate city bureaucracies, finding the right person to call when official channels stalled. I got better at reading people, understanding what motivated them, what they feared, what they valued enough to compromise on. I discovered I had a talent for coalition building, bringing together groups that normally didn't talk to each other, finding common ground between neighborhood associations and homeless advocates, between faith communities and city planners. The work changed me in ways I couldn't have predicted. I became patient in a way I'd never been before, understanding that real change operated on timelines measured in years, not weeks. I got comfortable with conflict, learned that disagreement wasn't personal failure, that sometimes the most productive meetings were the ones where people argued passionately before finding solutions. I developed a thick skin for rejection and disappointment because most of what we tried didn't work, at least not the first time. But I also became harder in some ways that worried me. I got cynical about developers who talked about community benefit while designing projects that would displace hundreds of people. I became impatient with bureaucrats who hid behind procedures when what was needed was courage and creativity. And I grew distant from people who'd never had to think about where they'd sleep at night or whether they could afford both rent and food. That distance extended to my own family. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday celebration drove the wedge deeper. They'd talk about their world of contracts and clients and profit margins, and I'd sit there knowing that their success often came at the cost of exactly the kind of displacement I spent my days fighting. My father's firm didn't design affordable housing. They designed luxury condos and upscale mixed-use developments, the kind of projects that looked beautiful in renderings and drove up property values and pushed out everyone who couldn't afford the new normal. I never said this out loud. It would have detonated whatever fragile connection we still maintained. But I thought it every time my father talked about his latest commission or Dylan shared photos of some gleaming new building going up in a neighborhood that used to be affordable. I thought about the families who used to live wherever that building now stood, wondered where they'd gone, whether anyone had helped them or whether they'd just been absorbed into the statistics. The silence between us grew into something almost comfortable in its predictability. They stopped asking what I was doing because they didn't want to hear about work they considered beneath notice. I stopped sharing because I was tired of watching their eyes glaze over, or their expressions shift into poorly concealed disappointment. We existed in parallel universes that occasionally intersected at obligatory family events, where we performed the rituals of connection without any of the substance. Dylan tried sometimes, to his credit. He'd corner me at gatherings, ask genuine questions about what I was working on, listen with what seemed like real interest. But then he'd pivot to suggestions about how I could use my experience to transition into real estate development or property management, career paths that would utilize my knowledge while actually making money. He meant well, I think, but he fundamentally didn't understand that I wasn't trying to climb a different ladder to the same place. I'd left the building entirely. The loneliness of it surprised me. I'd expected my family's disappointment, but not the isolation that came from choosing a path none of them could follow or even really see. I had colleagues and friends in the nonprofit world, people who understood the work and valued it. But they weren't the people I'd grown up with, weren't the ones who'd known me before I became this version of myself. There was a particular kind of loneliness in being unknowable to the people who were supposed to know you best. My mother felt it too, I think, though from the other side. She'd call sometimes, usually on Sunday afternoons, and we'd have conversations that felt like translating between languages neither of us fully spoke. She'd tell me about Dylan's achievements with a brightness that couldn't quite mask the question underneath it, the wondering about what had gone wrong with me. I'd offer updates designed to sound busier than they were successful, avoiding details that would only confirm her fears that I was wasting my life. Once during one of these calls, she'd asked me directly if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, maybe because it suggested she'd been thinking about me beyond the disappointment narrative. I'd paused long enough that the silence became awkward before answering that yes, I was happy, or at least content, which wasn't quite the same thing but was all I could honestly offer. Are you though? She'd pressed, her voice soft in a way that reminded me of childhood, of the mother who'd checked for monsters under my bed and kissed scraped knees. Because Marcus, sweetheart, from where we're sitting it doesn't look like happiness. It looks like you're struggling. I'm not struggling, I'd said, which was true in the ways that mattered to me and completely false in the ways that mattered to her. I'm doing work that needs doing. That's enough. The conversation had ended shortly after, both of us retreating to safer ground. But her question lingered. Was I happy? The work fulfilled me in ways I couldn't articulate. Every family that stayed house felt like proof that the world could bend toward justice if you pushed hard enough in the right places. But fulfillment wasn't the same as happiness, and there were nights when I lay awake in my small apartment, listening to the radiator clank and the neighbors argue, wondering what my life would have looked like if I'd stayed the course, finished Reed, maybe even joined the family firm. Those thoughts never lasted long. All I had to do was remember the families I'd helped, the systems we'd changed, the small but real difference the work made. That was worth more than my father's approval or my mother's peace of mind or the kind of comfortable life Dylan was building. At least that's what I told myself, and most of the time I believed it. The 8th year marked by with a rhythm I'd grown accustomed to. Cases opened and closed. Some families got the help they needed. Others fell through cracks we couldn't patch fast enough. The affordable housing crisis in Portland deepened as more tech companies moved in and property values climbed. We won small victories and suffered larger defeats, the usual ratio that characterized this kind of work. Then Elena called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. She had that look she got when something big was happening, a mixture of excitement and exhaustion that came from months of work finally paying off. Sit down, she'd said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, which was buried under the usual avalanche of files and paperwork. Remember the Morrison Street project she'd started? And I'd nodded immediately. Morrison Street had been our white whale for 3 years, a massive development proposal that would have demolished 2 blocks of older apartment buildings to make room for luxury housing. We'd fought it through every channel available, organizing tenants, flooding city council meetings, filing legal challenges, building a coalition of neighborhood groups and advocacy organizations. We'd lost that fight 6 months ago. The developer had gotten their permits, the existing tenants had been relocated, and demolition had already begun. It had been a brutal defeat, the kind that made you question whether any of this work actually mattered. But here's the thing, Elena continued, leaning forward with that intensity I'd learned meant she was about to reveal something important. The city had required the developer to include affordable units as part of the approval. 20% of the total, which we'd negotiated up from their original 5% offer. And they had to work with a nonprofit to manage those units. I'd known this already. It was cold comfort after losing the existing affordable housing, but at least it was something. They chose us, Elena said, and I felt my eyebrows rise. We're going to manage 75 affordable units in a brand new building. And I need someone to oversee the whole thing, work with the developer on design features that actually serve low-income residents, create the screening and placement process, hire the property management team, everything. She paused, holding my gaze. I want it to be you, Marcus. You've earned this. The project would be the biggest thing I'd ever managed, complex and visible in ways my usual work wasn't. It would mean long hours and high pressure and constant negotiation with a developer who probably resented having to include affordable housing at all. It would also mean creating something that would house families for decades, a tangible legacy that would outlast any single case or crisis. I'd said yes without hesitation. The Morrison Street project consumed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the workload, though that was substantial enough. It was the visibility of it, the way this single project kept expanding into something larger than housing units and square footage. The developer, a firm called Cascade Properties, had built their reputation on high-end residential towers that transformed neighborhoods, which was a polite way of saying they made places unaffordable for the people who'd lived there for generations. Working with them meant entering a world I'd spent 8 years positioning myself against. The first meeting happened in their downtown offices, all glass and steel and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd worn my best shirt, which was still noticeably cheaper than what their receptionist had on, and carried a worn leather portfolio that Elena had lent me because mine had duct tape holding one corner together. The project manager, a woman named Christine Aldrich, greeted me with a handshake that was firm but not warm, her expression suggesting she viewed this entire affordable housing component as a necessary irritation rather than a goal worth pursuing. "We need to be clear about expectations," she'd said before I'd even sat down fully. "Cascade has a reputation for quality, and we're not compromising our standards just because some units are below market rate. Your residents will be held to the same lease terms as everyone else." I'd smiled, the expression I'd learned to deploy when I needed to be pleasant but firm. "And we need to be clear that affordable housing isn't charity," I'd replied. "The families we place will be paying rent just like everyone else. They deserve the same quality and the same respect. So let's start from that foundation and work forward." Something had flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or a reassessment. The meeting had proceeded from there. 2 hours of dense discussion about unit layouts and amenity access and lease structures. She'd pushed back on almost everything, citing costs and complications and market standards. I'd pushed right back, citing the development agreement they'd signed and the legal requirements they were bound to, and the reality that if this didn't work, we had city council members ready to hear about it. By the end, we'd reached a tentative understanding. She didn't like me, and I didn't particularly like her, but we both recognized we were stuck with each other and might as well make it work. She'd walked me to the elevator afterward, her expression thoughtful. "You're not what I expected," she'd said. "What did you expect?" I'd asked. "Someone easier to roll over," she'd admitted with something that might have been respect. "This is going to be an interesting project." Interesting was an understatement. Over the following months, I practically lived between our nonprofit office and Cascade's headquarters, reviewing architectural plans and material specifications, fighting for features that would actually serve low-income families. I pushed for larger kitchens because families on tight budgets cooked more at home. I insisted on soundproofing between units because thin walls and noise complaints led to conflicts that could end in evictions. I argued for on-site laundry facilities that were genuinely affordable, not the overpriced machines that turned a basic necessity into a luxury expense. Christine resisted almost everything on principle at first, then gradually started coming around as I demonstrated how each feature reduced turnover costs and long-term maintenance issues. She was a businesswoman above all else, and she could understand arguments framed in financial terms, even when they originated from values she didn't share. We developed a working relationship that was professional if not friendly, two people from different worlds finding common language in spreadsheets and building codes. The design process revealed how much I'd absorbed over the years about architecture and development, knowledge I'd picked up through proximity to my father's work, even as I'd rejected his path. I understood load-bearing walls and mechanical systems, could read blueprints and spot potential problems before they became expensive mistakes. Christine noticed, commenting once that I seemed to know my way around a set of plans better than most nonprofit coordinators she'd worked with. I deflected the observation, uncomfortable with acknowledging how much of my family's world I carried whether I wanted to or not. But it was useful knowledge, giving me credibility in meetings where I might otherwise have been dismissed as an idealistic do-gooder who didn't understand the practical realities of construction and development. I could speak their language when I needed to, even as I used it to advocate for priorities they'd never have chosen themselves. The project timeline stretched across 18 months, From those first contentious meetings through design development and construction, I visited the site regularly, watching the building rise from foundation to framing to the finished exterior that would have fit seamlessly into any luxury development. The difference was invisible from the outside, which was exactly the point. The families who'd live in the affordable units wouldn't be marked or separated or made to feel lesser. They'd have the same lobby, the same elevators, the same access to the rooftop terrace and the community room and all the amenities that market-rate tenants enjoyed. Making that happen required constant vigilance. Cascade kept trying to create separate entrances or different finishes for affordable units, small distinctions they swore were just practical necessities, but that would have created a two-tier system within the building. I shut down each attempt, sometimes through negotiation and sometimes through reminders about fair housing law and the terms of their development agreement. Christine grew to expect my objections, building in extra time for meetings where she knew I'd refuse whatever cost-saving measure they'd come up with. "You're exhausting," she'd told me once, though her tone suggested it was almost a compliment. "Has anyone ever told you that?" Frequently I'd replied, usually right before they agreed to do things the right way. The families began applying 6 months before move-in, a flood of applications that reinforced why this work mattered. Single mothers working 2 jobs to stay afloat. Elderly couples on fixed incomes watching their neighborhood become unaffordable. Young families just starting out who couldn't find anything they could afford in a city where rents had doubled in a decade. Each application represented people trying to build stable lives in an economic system designed to keep them precarious. The selection process was agonizing. We had 75 units and over 400 qualified applicants. Every family we housed meant multiple families we couldn't help, a calculus that never got easier no matter how many times I did it. I developed a scoring system that prioritized the most vulnerable, while trying to create a diverse community that would be stable long-term. Families with children, veterans, people transitioning out of homelessness, workers in essential industries that kept the city running, but didn't pay enough to afford market-rate housing. Elena reviewed every decision I made, not because she didn't trust me, but because the responsibility was too heavy for one person to carry alone. We debated borderline cases late into the night, weighing different forms of need against each other, knowing that whatever we decided would change the trajectory of people's lives. It was the kind of work that accumulated weight in your chest, the awareness that behind every application number was a family hoping for a chance. The building opened in late September, a ceremonial ribbon cutting that Cascade used as a marketing opportunity, complete with catered refreshments and a local city council member who gave a speech about Portland's commitment to inclusive development. I stood at the back of the crowd, watching Christine smile for photographers and the council member take credit for policies our coalition had forced through over his initial objections. Elena stood beside me, her arms crossed, her expression wry. "This is the part where they pretend it was their idea all along," she'd murmured. "As long as the families get housed," I'd replied, "I don't care who takes the credit." "That's what I've been trying to teach you for 8 years," she'd said, bumping her shoulder against mine. "You're finally learning." The first families moved in over the following 2 weeks, truck after truck pulling up to the loading dock, carrying the accumulated possessions of lives that had often been compressed into storage units or friends' garages during the gap between application and approval. I helped where I could, carrying boxes and assembling furniture, learning names and stories, meeting the people who'd been abstractions on applications. There was Denise, a nurse who'd been commuting 90 minutes each way because she couldn't afford anything closer to the hospital where she worked. Her 2 kids would now be able to walk to a good school district instead of bouncing between whatever childcare she could patch together. There was Marcus, which made us both laugh, a veteran about my age who'd been living in his sister's basement after his marriage fell apart, and his PTSD made holding down a steady job nearly impossible. There was the Nugent family, restaurant workers who'd been doubled up with relatives in a 2-bedroom apartment meant for 4 people, not 9. Each move-in felt like a small miracle, the kind that happened because of years of unglamorous work, policy fights and budget negotiations and the grinding effort of creating systems that actually functioned. This was what success looked like in my world, not ribbon cuttings or awards, but families getting keys to apartments they could afford, kids getting their own bedrooms, parents breathing easier because they wouldn't be evicted next month. I'd been working at the building site on the afternoon my mother called, helping Denise figure out why her stove wasn't heating properly. It turned out to be something simple, a breaker that needed resetting, but she'd been nervous about calling maintenance on her first day, afraid of seeming difficult or incompetent. I'd shown her the breaker box, explained that calling for help was part of what rent paid for, reminded her that this was her home now, and she had every right to make it work properly. My phone had buzzed in my pocket as I was leaving, my mother's name on the screen. I'd almost let it go to voicemail, still sweaty and dusty from moving boxes, not in the mood for another careful conversation about nothing. But something made me answer. "Marcus," she'd said, and her voice had that quality that meant this wasn't a routine check-in. "I need you to come to dinner Thursday. 6 o'clock. It's important." I'd hesitated, running through my mental calendar. Thursday was packed with meetings about placing the remaining families, interviews with candidates for the on-site support coordinator position, a dozen things that felt more urgent than another uncomfortable family meal. "I'm pretty slammed this week," I'd started. "It's Thanksgiving, Marcus," she'd interrupted. "And your father specifically asked that you be there. Please." The please was what got me. My mother didn't beg, didn't plead. She commanded politely and expected compliance. Hearing vulnerability in her voice was unusual enough to make me agree before I'd thought it through. I'd find time somehow, rearrange whatever needed rearranging. Family dinner at 6 on Thursday. I'd be there. The days leading up to Thanksgiving blurred together in the usual chaos. Two families needed emergency assistance with utility deposits. A conflict between neighbors required mediation before it escalated. Christine called with questions about lease renewals even though the building had barely been open a month. Elena pulled me into a strategy meeting about another development proposal that threatened displacement in a different neighborhood. I worked late every night, collapsed into bed without eating properly, woke up to do it again. By Thursday afternoon, I was running behind and too exhausted to care about appearances. I'd meant to go home and change, maybe shower and put on something that wouldn't embarrass my mother. Instead, I drove straight from a site visit where I'd been crawling around a basement checking for mold issues. My jeans dirty and my shirt wrinkled. A coffee stain on the collar I hadn't noticed until I was already in the car. Traffic was heavy with holiday travelers. Everyone heading somewhere to eat turkey and pretend their families were functional. I sat in gridlock on the bridge, watching the Willamette River catch the last of the afternoon light, trying to psych myself up for the performance ahead. Smile and nod. Don't rise to the bait when Dylan talks about his latest commission. Don't argue when my father makes some comment about real careers. Survive dessert and escape as soon as socially acceptable. I pulled up to the Craftsman house at 6:15, late enough to be noticed but not so late it became an incident. Dylan's car was already there, sleek and new, parked in the spot closest to the door. I left my battered Honda at the curb, gathering myself before walking up the stone path I'd traversed 1,000 times, heading toward a door that had stopped feeling like home years ago, but still exerted a gravitational pull I couldn't quite escape. The door opened before I could knock, my mother appearing in the doorway with that expression she wore when company was coming, the one where everything had to be perfect. Her eyes swept over me quickly, taking in the coffee stain and the wrinkled shirt and the general appearance of someone who'd been working rather than preparing for a holiday dinner. Her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, but she stepped aside to let me in without comment. "Your father's in the dining room," she said, taking my jacket even though I hadn't offered it yet. "Dylan's already here." I followed her through the familiar hallway, past family photos that chronicled our lives in carefully curated moments. There I was at 10, gap-toothed and smiling at some achievement I couldn't remember anymore. There was Dylan at his college graduation, my parents flanking him with pride so visible it radiated from the frame. The progression told a story, I realized, of one son who kept appearing in new accomplishments and another who seemed to fade after a certain point, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The dining room looked exactly as it always did for Thanksgiving. The table set with the good china and crystal glasses that came out twice a year. The centerpiece was elaborate, autumn leaves and small pumpkins arranged with the kind of precision my mother brought to everything. Dylan sat in his usual spot, still wearing his suit from work, looking like he'd stepped out of a catalog for successful young professionals. My father occupied the head of the table, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. "Marcus," my father said, his tone neutral. "You made it." Traffic was heavy, I replied, sliding into my designated chair, the one furthest from him. "Sorry I'm late." My mother bustled in with serving dishes, steam rising from sweet potatoes and green beans, and all the traditional accompaniments. The turkey sat in front of my father, waiting for him to carve it with the precision he brought to everything, each slice perfectly even. We went through the ritual of filling plates and passing dishes, the choreography we performed so many times it required no thought. For a while, there was only the sound of silverware against plates and the occasional request to pass something. The silence felt heavy, weighted with something I couldn't identify. Usually, these dinners followed a predictable pattern. Dylan would share updates from work, my parents would ask engaged questions, I would contribute minimally and try to disappear into the background. But tonight, nobody was speaking, and the quiet stretched until it became uncomfortable. Finally, my father set down his fork with deliberate care. "Marcus," he said, and I looked up to find him studying me with an intensity one hadn't seen directed at me in years. "We need to have a conversation." My stomach tightened. Conversations that started this way never went anywhere good. I set down my own fork, meeting his gaze, waiting for whatever was coming. "Your mother and I have been patient," he continued, his voice measured. "We've given you space to figure things out, to get this non-profit phase out of your system. But 8 years is long enough. It's time for you to be realistic about your future." The non-profit phase. As if everything I'd built, everyone I'd helped, was just an extended tantrum I'd eventually outgrow. I felt heat rising in my chest but kept my voice level. "I am being realistic about my future. I have a career." "You have a job that barely pays your bills," my mother interjected, her voice strained. "Marcus, we've watched you struggle for almost a decade. Living in that terrible apartment, driving that awful car, wearing clothes that look like they came from a donation bin." "Some of them did," I said before I could stop myself. Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between our parents and me. The role of mediator didn't suit him, but he tried anyway. "Maybe we could approach this differently," he started. My father raised a hand, cutting him off. "I've made some calls," he said, turning back to me. "There's a position available at Bennett and Associates. Junior project manager. You'd be working under Dylan initially, learning the business properly. The salary would be triple what you're making now. Benefits, retirement contributions, a real future." I stared at him, processing what he was offering. It wasn't just a job. It was a return to the fold. A chance to step back into the narrative they'd constructed for me. The one where I'd been lost but could be found again. All I had to do was admit that the last 8 years had been a mistake, that their way was the right way, that their values were the ones that mattered. "Dad, I appreciate the offer," I started carefully. "But I'm not interested in project management. I have work that matters to me." "Work that matters," my father repeated, and there was an edge to his voice now. "Marcus, you're nearly 30 years old. You have an education you never finished, a resume full of gaps and nonprofit work that won't translate to any real career. What happens when you're 40 and still barely making rent? When you're 50 and have nothing saved for retirement?" He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "This fantasy you're living, this idea that you're saving the world, it's not sustainable. And we're not going to enable it anymore." The words hung in the air between us. My mother was staring at her plate, her hands twisted together in her lap. Dylan looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. And my father watched me with an expression that mixed concern and disappointment, and something that looked almost like anger. "Enable it," I repeated slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means we're done supporting this," my mother said quietly. "We've let you make your choices, Marcus. But we're your parents and we can't just watch you throw your life away." My father's voice cut through again, hard and final. "You have a choice to make. Accept the position at Bennett and Associates, or you're no longer welcome in this house." The ultimatum landed like a physical blow. I'd expected disappointment, prepared for criticism, but this was something else entirely. They were drawing a line, forcing me to choose between the life I'd built and the family I'd been born into. "You're serious," I said, looking between them. "You're actually giving me an ultimatum. Your job or your family?" "We're giving you reality," my father replied. "You can reject it if you want. But there will be consequences." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. For 8 years I'd sat at this table and absorbed their judgment, let their disappointment wash over me without defending myself. I'd kept my mouth shut about what I actually did, about the families I'd helped and the systems I'd changed and the real tangible difference the work made. I'd let them believe I was wasting my life because explaining seemed pointless, because they'd made up their minds and nothing I said would change them. But standing there, looking at my father's hard expression and my mother's worried eyes and Dylan's careful neutrality, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was finally having had enough. But I felt the weight of 8 years of silence pressing down and knew I couldn't carry it anymore. "You want reality," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Here's reality. The Morrison Street project you've probably heard about, the big mixed-use development with the affordable housing component that everyone said couldn't be done? I managed that. All 75 affordable units. I worked with Cascade Properties for 18 months to make sure those units actually served the families they were meant for, not just check some box so developers could get their permits." My father's expression flickered, surprise breaking through his certainty. I kept going, the words coming faster now. "I've helped house over 300 families in 8 years. Real families with real lives who would be on the streets or in shelters or doubled up with relatives in unsafe conditions if not for the work I do. I've changed zoning ordinances and landlord-tenant laws. I've trained other advocates and built coalitions and created systems that will keep helping people long after I'm gone. But none of that counts," I continued, hearing my voice rise despite my effort to stay calm. "None of it matters because it doesn't come with a title you can brag about at your dinner parties, or a salary that impresses your friends. You want me to give up work that actually changes people's lives so I can help build luxury condos for people who already have everything they need." "Marcus," my mother started, but I wasn't finished. "You talk about reality like you have some monopoly on it," I said, looking at my father. "Like the only things that are real are the ones you can see and measure and put on a balance sheet. But I've seen more reality in the last 8 years than you've probably encountered in your entire career. I've sat with families facing eviction, held crying kids who didn't understand why they had to leave their home, watched people lose everything because the system is designed to protect property over people. The silence that followed was different now, charged with something that felt like possibility or disaster or both. "Your work is real," I said finally. "Building beautiful structures matters. But so does making sure people have structures to live in at all. And I'm good at what I do. Really good. The families I've helped know it. The people I work with know it. The developers who don't want to negotiate with me know it, because I make their lives difficult when they try to cut corners or violate agreements." I picked up my jacket from where my mother had draped it over a chair. "The only people who don't seem to know it are the ones in this room," I said. "And honestly, after 8 years, I'm tired of trying to convince you. So here's my choice. I'm keeping my job. And if that means I'm not welcome here anymore, then I guess I'm not welcome." "Marcus," Dylan said, speaking for the first time in minutes. "Come on, let's all take a breath here." I looked at him, my younger brother who'd done everything right and reaped all the rewards that came with fitting the family mold. "I don't need a breath, Dylan. I need them to see me for who I actually am, not who they wanted me to be." My father stood up, his chair scraping back. His face had gone red, the color that meant his temper was rising. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice tight. "You're choosing poverty and struggle over opportunity and stability. That's not courage, Marcus. That's foolishness." "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe it's the first honest choice I've made in your presence in 8 years." I walked toward the door, my mother trailing behind me, her hands fluttering like she wanted to reach out but didn't know how. "Marcus, please," she said. "Don't leave like this." I paused in the doorway, looking back at the scene we'd created. The perfect Thanksgiving table, the untouched food, my father standing rigid with anger, Dylan still frozen in his chair, my mother caught between us all. It looked like a painting of a family moment, beautiful and hollow. "I love you," I said, because it was true despite everything. "But I can't keep pretending to be failing just to make your narrative work. Call me if you ever want to know who I actually am." Then I walked out, closing the door behind me with a soft click that felt more final than any slam could have been. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur. My hands shook on the steering wheel, adrenaline and anger, and something that might have been grief churning through me. I'd burned the bridge, said things that couldn't be unsaid, chosen my work over my family in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Part of me wanted to turn around, apologize, take the job offer, and smooth everything over. The larger part knew I couldn't, that something fundamental had broken and trying to fix it would mean breaking myself instead. My phone started ringing before I'd even made it home. Dylan's name lit up the screen. Then my mother. Then Dylan again. I let them all go to voicemail, not ready to rehash or defend or explain any further. I'd said what needed saying. Now I just needed to sit with the consequences. The apartment felt smaller than usual when I let myself in, the radiator already clanking its evening symphony. I collapsed on my second-hand couch, still in my dirty clothes, and stared at the ceiling with its water stain that looked like a map of somewhere I'd never been. The silence was profound, broken only by the usual city sounds filtering through thin windows. For the first time in years, I had no idea what happened next with my family. The script we'd been following was torn up, and I didn't know if we'd write a new one or just stop performing altogether. My phone buzzed with a text. "Elena, you okay? You missed our check-in." I'd completely forgotten we'd scheduled a call to discuss the remaining unit placements. I typed back quickly. "Family dinner went sideways. I'm fine. Can we talk tomorrow?" Her response came immediately. "Of course. And Marcus, whatever happened, you're doing good work. Don't forget that." I set the phone down, Elena's words settling into the hollow space the evening had created. She was right. The work was good. It mattered. And I'd chosen it, not just tonight but every day for 8 years, in small ways and large ones. Tonight was just the first time I'd chosen it out loud, in front of the people whose approval I'd been mourning the loss of since the day I left Reed. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, replaying the conversation, thinking of things I could have said differently or better. But underneath the regret and uncertainty was something else, something that felt almost like relief. I'd been carrying the weight of their disappointment for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The lightness was disorienting, like suddenly noticing a burden only after you'd set it down. The next morning brought a voicemail from my mother, her voice careful and strained. "Marcus, I know you're upset. We all said things in the heat of the moment. But please, let's talk about this. Call me when you're ready." I wasn't ready. I went to work instead, throwing myself into the familiar rhythm of case files and phone calls and problems that had solutions, unlike family dynamics that seemed designed to resist resolution. The Morrison Street building needed attention, residents settling in with the usual mix of minor issues and adjustment challenges. I spent the morning troubleshooting a problem with the mail system and mediating a noise complaint between neighbors who were still learning how to live in close proximity. Elena pulled me aside mid-afternoon, her expression concerned. "Your mom called the office," she said. "She seemed worried about you." "I'm fine," I replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm not fine. But I will be." She studied me for a moment, that look she got when she was deciding whether to push. "Want to tell me what happened?" So I did, the whole story spilling out in the break room over terrible coffee. The ultimatum, my response, the bridge I'd burned. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression growing more understanding as I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That took guts." "Did it?" I asked. "Or was it just self-destructive?" "Maybe both," she admitted. "But Marcus, you've been living in 2 worlds for 8 years. One where you're failing and one where you're succeeding. That's not sustainable. Something had to give." "I just thought it would give differently," I said. "I thought maybe eventually they'd come around, see what I was doing, understand it mattered. Some people can't see value in work that doesn't fit their definition," Elena replied. "That's their limitation, not yours." Her words stayed with me through the afternoon and into the following days. My mother kept calling, leaving increasingly worried messages. Dylan texted asking if we could meet for coffee, his tone careful and diplomatic. My father remained silent, which somehow felt worse than anger would have. I didn't respond to any of them. I needed space to figure out who I was without their judgment shaping me, without the constant effort of managing their disappointment. The work continued, demanding and fulfilling, filling the space my family had occupied. I placed the last families in Morrison Street units. I started preliminary work on another development proposal. I trained a new volunteer who reminded me of myself at 21, idealistic and angry, and looking for ways to channel both into something constructive. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The holiday season approached with its usual demands, invitations to parties and events that would normally include awkward family obligations. This year there were none. No Christmas dinner invite. No mention of New Year's plans. The silence from my father's side was complete, and my mother's calls had tapered off to one per week, tentative check-ins that I still wasn't ready to return. Then, on a cold afternoon in early December, Elena called me into her office with that expression that meant something significant had happened. "There's someone here to see you," she said, and before I could ask who, she stepped aside to reveal Christine Aldrich from Cascade Properties. Christine stood awkwardly in our shabby non-profit office, looking as out of place as an orchid in a vegetable garden. Her usual confidence seemed diminished, her expression uncertain. "Marcus," she said, "do you have a few minutes?" We sat in the conference room, which was really just a corner with a table and mismatched chairs, and she explained why she'd come. Cascade was planning another major development, this one even larger than Morrison Street. The city was requiring 40% affordable housing, and Cascade wanted our nonprofit to manage it. More specifically, she said, they wanted me to oversee it. "After Morrison Street, you have a reputation," Christine explained. "Developers know you're tough to work with, which means you're effective. The city trusts you. And honestly, the building works. We've had fewer issues with the mixed-income model than anyone predicted." She slid a folder across the table. "This is the proposal. 200 units, 80 of them affordable. It would be the largest project of its kind in Portland, and it would need someone who can navigate both worlds, development and advocacy." I opened the folder, scanning the preliminary plans and budget projections. The scope was enormous, potentially transformative for affordable housing in the city. It was also risky, complicated, the kind of project that could consume years and still fail if any piece fell apart. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, looking up from the papers. "Because I need to know if you're interested before I take it to my board," Christine replied. "And because there's someone you should meet." She stood, gesturing for me to follow her out to the parking lot. A black car was idling at the curb, expensive and sleek, exactly the kind developers drove. Christine opened the back door, and I peered inside to see my father sitting in the passenger seat, his expression unreadable. My stomach dropped. "What is this?" I started to ask, but Christine interrupted. "Your father contacted me 3 days ago," she said. "Asked for a meeting about the Morrison Street project. He wanted to know about the affordable housing component, how it was structured, whether it was actually working. We talked for 2 hours. She glanced at the car, then back at me. "He didn't know, Marcus. He didn't know what you'd accomplished. And when I told him, when I showed him the documentation and explained what you'd done, he asked me not to tell you he'd been asking questions." I stood frozen, trying to process this information. My father researching my work. My father reaching out to the developer I'd been battling with for 18 months. My father learning the truth he'd been too proud or stubborn to ask me for directly. "He requested this meeting," Christine continued. "Asked me to bring the new proposal to you in front of him so he could see how you work." She smiled slightly. "I think he wanted proof. Or maybe permission to be proud of you." The car door opened and my father stepped out, moving slowly like he'd aged years in the 3 weeks since Thanksgiving. His suit was immaculate as always, but something in his posture had changed, a slight bow to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen directed at me before. It looked almost like respect. "Marcus," he said, his voice rough. "We need to talk." We ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the nonprofit office. One of those neighborhood places with mismatched furniture and locally roasted beans that my father would normally avoid in favor of somewhere more polished. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me at a wobbly table, his hands wrapped around the cup like he needed something to anchor himself. I watched him struggle to find words. This man who'd always known exactly what to say, who'd built a career on confident presentations and decisive communication. "I visited the Morrison Street building," he finally said, his eyes on his coffee rather than on me. "Told them I was considering a similar project for one of our developments, wanted to see how the mixed-income model functioned in practice. They gave me a tour of the affordable units." He paused, his jaw working like the words were difficult to extract. "They were identical to the market-rate apartments, Marcus. Same finishes, same appliances, same access to amenities." The property manager kept talking about the coordinator who'd insisted on it, who'd fought for every detail to ensure there was no distinction between residents based on income. I waited, letting him work through whatever he'd come to say. "I didn't connect it to you at first," he continued. Then she mentioned your name. Said you'd been the most demanding person she'd ever worked with, but also the most effective. Said Cascade initially tried to cut corners and you shut down every attempt. That you understood construction and development well enough that they couldn't hide behind technical jargon or claim things were impossible when they were just inconvenient. His hands tightened around the cup. I stood there listening to a property manager praise my son's work. And I realized I'd never asked you what you actually did. Not once in 8 years. I just assumed you were wasting your potential because you weren't doing what I would have done. The coffee shop hummed with ambient conversation around us, other people living their ordinary lives while my father attempted something that clearly wasn't ordinary for him, an admission of error, an acknowledgement that his version of reality hadn't been complete. Christine walked me through the development process, he said. Showed me the agreements you'd negotiated, the design modifications you'd pushed for, the legal framework you'd helped establish. Marcus, that project is more complex than most of what we do at Bennett & Associates. The coordination required between nonprofit management, city housing authority, legal compliance, property development, and community relations, it's sophisticated work. He finally looked up, meeting my eyes. I contacted 4 other developers you've worked with over the past week. Every single one of them knew your name. 2 of them actually groaned when I mentioned you, said you made their lives difficult but that their projects were better for it. One said you were the most knowledgeable affordable housing advocate in the region. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications. My father had spent a week researching my life, investigating the work he'd dismissed for 8 years. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to throw his words from Thanksgiving back at him about fantasy and reality. But mostly I just felt tired, and maybe a little sad that it had taken a stranger's validation for him to even look at what I'd been doing. Why now, I asked. Why suddenly care after all this time? Because your mother hasn't stopped crying since Thanksgiving, he said bluntly. Because Dylan told me I was going to lose my son over pride and stubbornness. Because I couldn't sleep at night thinking about the look on your face when you walked out of our house. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. And because when I really thought about it, about what you'd said that night, I realized I didn't actually know what you did all day. I knew the narrative I'd created, the story about you dropping out and wasting your education. But I didn't know the truth. So I decided to find out. What changed your mind, I asked. What made you decide to look? Your mother found something, he said. She was going through old papers, looking for a document related to taxes, and she came across a letter. It was from your department head at Reed, dated a few months after you withdrew. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to find something, then turned it toward me. It was a photo of a letter on Reed College letterhead. The paper yellowed with age. I recognized it immediately, though I'd never seen it before. Professor Chun had sent it to my parents' house, not realizing I'd already moved out. The letter praised my academic performance and expressed regret about my withdrawal. But more significantly, it mentioned that I'd been the student who'd brought the ethics violation to the administration's attention, that my actions had triggered an investigation that had led to significant reforms in how the college handled research funding and faculty conflicts of interest. Professor Chun had written that while he respected my decision to leave, he wanted my parents to know that I demonstrated exceptional integrity, and that Reed was worse off for my absence. Your mother showed it to me, my father said. Asked why we'd never seen it before, why you'd never told us. And I had no answer except that we'd never asked. We'd been so certain we knew what happened that we never bothered to get your version. He pocketed his phone, his expression pained. That letter sat in a box for 8 years, Marcus. Proof that you didn't just quit, that you left for reasons that had nothing to do with failure or weakness. And we never knew because we'd already decided what your story was. The revelation should have felt more significant, but instead it just felt like another piece of evidence in a case that had already been decided. They'd had information that contradicted their narrative, and they'd literally filed it away without reading it. Even now, learning the truth, my father was framing it as an innocent misunderstanding rather than a choice they'd made repeatedly to believe the worst. I appreciate you telling me this, I said carefully, and I appreciate you taking the time to research what I do. But Dad, this doesn't change what happened at Thanksgiving. You gave me an ultimatum. You told me to quit my job or leave your house. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a choice. I know, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. I know, Marcus. And I was wrong. I was so convinced I knew what was best for you that I couldn't see you'd already figured that out for yourself. He leaned forward, his expression more open than I'd seen it in years. I can't take back what I said. I can't undo 8 years of making you feel like a failure when you were actually succeeding in ways I was too narrow-minded to recognize. But I'm here now trying to understand. Trying to see you as you actually are instead of as I wanted you to be. The words were right, but there was something performative about them, like he'd rehearsed this speech. My father wasn't comfortable with vulnerability, with admitting error. This conversation was costing him something, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine transformation or just another negotiation, finding the right approach to resolve a problem. Christine's project, I said, changing the subject. Why did she want you there when she presented it? Because I asked her to, he admitted. I wanted to see how you work, how you handle high-stakes negotiations. And I wanted you to see that I'm paying attention now, that I'm trying to learn who you actually are. That felt more honest, more like the father I knew. Always strategic, always thinking several moves ahead. He'd orchestrated this meeting, used Christine as a conduit, created a situation where I'd have to see him taking my work seriously. What did you think? I asked. Watching Christine present the project? I think you'd be crazy to turn it down, he said immediately. It's an opportunity to shape housing policy for the entire city, to create a model that other developments will have to follow. The scale alone makes it significant. He paused, then added more quietly, I also think you're the right person to do it. Christine told me she specifically requested you, because she trusts you to fight for what matters while still understanding the realities of development. That's a rare combination. The compliment landed strangely, something I'd been starving for but now wasn't sure how to digest. I wanted my father's respect, had wanted it for 8 years. But getting it now, after everything, felt complicated in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I haven't decided about the project yet, I said. It's a lot to take on and I need to discuss it with Elena and the rest of the team. This isn't just about me. I understand, my father said. But Marcus, I hope you'll consider it. And I hope you'll also consider whether there's a way back for us. For our family. There it was, the real reason for this meeting. The research into my work, the orchestrated presentation, the carefully worded apology, all of it was building toward this moment. He wanted reconciliation, wanted to undo the damage from Thanksgiving, wanted his family intact again. I don't know, I said honestly. I appreciate that you're trying, Dad. I really do. But you can't just spend a week learning about my work and expect that to erase 8 years of making me feel invisible. This isn't a project you can fix with the right strategy and enough research. His face tightened, frustration flickering across his features before he controlled it. What do you want from me, Marcus? I'm here. I'm admitting I was wrong. I'm trying to make amends. What else can I do? The question was fair, and I didn't have a good answer. What did I want? An apology, yes, but more than that. I wanted him to sit with the discomfort of having been wrong, to really feel what 8 years of dismissal had done rather than just intellectually acknowledging it. I wanted my mother to understand why I'd let them believe their narrative instead of fighting it. I wanted Dylan to recognize the privilege of fitting perfectly into expectations he'd never had to question. But wanting those things felt impossible, like asking people to become fundamentally different versions of themselves. My father was who he was, pragmatic and strategic and uncomfortable with emotions that couldn't be solved through action. Expecting him to transform into someone else seemed unfair, even as I wished he could. I need time, I finally said. Time to process all of this, to figure out what reconciliation even looks like. You can't snap your fingers and have everything go back to normal, Dad. There is no normal anymore. He nodded slowly, disappointment clear in his expression but also something like understanding. Fair enough, he said. Take whatever time you need. But Marcus, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I should have said that 8 years ago, but I'm saying it now. The work you do matters and you're good at it. And I'm proud to be your father. The words hit harder than I expected, cracking something in my chest that had been sealed tight for years. I'd wanted to hear those words for so long that having them now felt almost painful, like blood rushing back into a limb that had fallen asleep. I swallowed hard, not trusting my voice. We sat in silence for a moment, the coffee shop continuing its routine around us. Finally, my father stood, adjusting his jacket in that way he did when a meeting was concluding. I should let you get back to work, he said. But please think about what I said. About the project and about us. I will, I promised and meant it. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, setting it on the table between us. "That's my direct line," he said. "Not the office number you probably deleted years ago. My cell phone. Call anytime, Marcus. For anything." Then he left, walking out into the December cold with his shoulders a little less bowed than when he'd arrived. I sat there for a long time after, staring at the business card, processing everything that had been said and everything that hadn't been. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "How did it go?" I typed back slowly, trying to find words for the mess of emotions churning through me. "Complicated. Need to think. Can we talk tomorrow?" Her response was immediate. "Of course. And Marcus, whatever you decide, I've got your back." The next few days were a blur of internal debate. Christine's project proposal sat on my desk, impossible to ignore. 200 units with 80 reserved for affordable housing represented a massive opportunity, the kind of impact that could reshape the city's approach to development. But it also represented years of work, constant negotiation, and the weight of knowing that hundreds of families' futures would depend on decisions I made. Elena and I discussed it at length, mapping out what taking on the project would mean for our organization. We'd need to hire additional staff, expand our capacity, take on debt to cover upfront costs before grant funding came through. It was risky, potentially transformative, exactly the kind of challenge that made this work feel urgent and alive. But underneath the practical considerations was the personal dimension. Taking this project would mean working even more closely with Christine and, by extension, with developers in my father's world. It would mean becoming more visible, harder to ignore, impossible to write off as just someone doing inconsequential nonprofit work. Part of me wanted that validation, wanted to prove to my family and everyone else that what I did mattered. Another part resented needing to prove anything at all. I called Dylan on a Friday evening, needing to hear from someone who existed in both worlds, family and work, who might understand the complexity I was wrestling with. He answered on the second ring, relief evident in his voice. "Marcus," he said, "I've been wanting to call you but didn't know if you'd pick up." "I'm calling now," I replied. "Can you talk?" We met at a brewery near his condo, one of those trendy places with industrial decor and craft beers that all tasted vaguely similar to me, but that Dylan could apparently distinguish between with the sophistication of a sommelier. He ordered an IPA I'd never heard of. I got a lager because it was familiar. "Dad told me about your meeting," Dylan said once we'd settled into a corner booth. "Said you let him explain himself, didn't just shut him down immediately." I listened, I corrected. "That's not the same as accepting his apology or agreeing that everything's fine now." Dylan nodded, picking at the label on his beer bottle. "I know. And for what it's worth, I think you were right. Thanksgiving, I mean. What you said about reality and whose work matters. That landed for me." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. About how easy it's been for me, following the path that was already laid out. I never had to fight for respect or prove my work was valuable. It was just assumed because I was doing what they expected." There was something vulnerable in his expression, a crack in the polished surface he usually presented. "Meanwhile, you chose something harder," he continued. "Something that actually helps people who need help. And we made you feel like garbage for it because it didn't fit our definition of success." "I'm not looking for an apology from you," I said, though I appreciated the acknowledgement. "You didn't give me an ultimatum. You didn't make me choose." "No, but I didn't defend you either," Dylan replied. "I sat there at that dinner and let Dad back you into a corner. I could have said something, pushed back, told them they were being unreasonable. I didn't because it was easier not to. The admission hung between us, honest in a way my brother and I rarely were with each other. We'd spent years existing in parallel, him in the spotlight and me in the shadows, neither quite knowing how to bridge the gap our different choices had created." "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "About the project Christine offered? About Dad?" Dylan took a long drink of his beer, considering. "About the project, I think you already know what you're going to do. You're going to take it because it's too important not to. That's who you are, Marcus. You can't walk away from something that could help that many families." He was right, and I'd known it before I even asked. The question wasn't whether I'd take the project but how to navigate what it meant. As for Dad, Dylan continued, "That's harder. He's trying, but he's also still Dad. He's going to be strategic about it, going to approach reconciliation like a project he can manage and solve. That's probably going to frustrate you, but it's also the best he can do. Can you live with that? I asked. With him being who he is instead of who I wish he'd be. That's the question, isn't it? Dylan said. I don't have an answer for you. But I know you can't keep living in limbo. Either find a way forward with them or don't, but make a choice. We talked for another hour, ranging over topics we'd never discussed before. He told me about the pressure of living up to expectations, how success had felt hollow sometimes because it came so easily. I told him about the families I'd helped, the ones that kept me going when the work felt overwhelming. We weren't close, not really, but we were more honest than we'd ever been, and that felt like its own kind of progress. When I got home that night, I called my mother. She answered immediately, her voice tight with hope and fear. Marcus, she said. Thank you for calling. I wanted to let you know I'm taking the project, I said. The new development Christine offered. It's a big opportunity and I'm going to say yes. She was quiet for a moment, processing. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Your father will be pleased. He's been hoping you'd accept. I'm not doing it for Dad, I clarified gently. I'm doing it because it's the right move for the work. But I wanted you to know. And I wanted to tell you that I'm willing to try. With the family. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm willing to try. I heard her breath catch, relief flooding through the phone line. Oh, Marcus. That's all I wanted to hear. We'll figure out the rest. We'll take it slow. Whatever you need. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully avoiding the difficult topics, sticking to safe ground. But when we hung up, something felt different. Not fixed, not healed, but maybe fractionally less broken. The project officially launched in January. A massive undertaking that consumed every waking hour. I hired 3 new staff members and absorbed a consulting architect who'd worked on mixed-income housing projects in Seattle. Christine and I fell into a working rhythm that was combative but productive. Each of us pushing the other toward solutions neither would have found alone. My father kept his distance, which I appreciated. He'd send occasional texts asking how the project was progressing, offering resources from Bennett and Associates if I needed them, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. My mother called weekly, and gradually those calls became less strained, more like actual conversations than careful negotiations through a minefield. Dylan started dropping by the project site, initially claiming he wanted to study the architectural integration of affordable housing for a proposal his firm was developing. But he kept coming back, asking questions about resident services and income qualifications, and how we balance community needs with development constraints. I watched him gradually understand what I did in ways he never had before, seeing the work as something complex and valuable rather than just well-intentioned but impractical. 6 months into the project, my mother invited me to dinner. Not a family gathering, just her and me. I almost declined, comfortable in the détente we'd established through phone calls and texts. But something in her voice suggested this mattered, so I agreed. We met at a restaurant in her neighborhood, nothing fancy, just a local place with good pasta and reasonable prices. She looked nervous when I arrived, her hands twisting her napkin the way they did when she was anxious. I wanted to apologize properly, she said once we'd ordered. Not over the phone or in front of your father. Just you and me. She took a breath, steadying herself. I failed you, Marcus. For 8 years, I let you believe we saw you as a disappointment when what we really felt was scared. Scared that you weren't building the kind of security we thought you needed. Scared that you'd struggle and suffer, and we wouldn't be able to help. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. But our fear became judgment, and that judgment hurt you. Made you feel like you had to hide who you were and what you'd accomplished. I'm so sorry for that, sweetheart. So sorry we made you feel invisible in your own family. The apology was raw and genuine in ways my father's careful words hadn't been. My mother was admitting not just error but complicity, acknowledging that her silence had been its own form of harm. I forgive you, I said, and meant it. But Mom, we can't go back to how things were. I need you to see me as I actually am, not as who you wish I'd become. I know, she said. And I'm trying. Your father and I both are. It's harder than you might think, letting go of the future we imagined for you. But we're learning that the future you've built is just as valid, maybe more so. We ate dinner and talked about safer things, but the conversation lingered in my mind long after. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a single moment but a process, something that had to be chosen repeatedly. My family was trying and so was I, and maybe that was enough for now. The building broke ground in September, A small ceremony that Christine insisted on despite my protests about the optics of celebrating before we'd actually accomplished anything. The city council member showed up, along with reporters from 2 local papers and a television station. Elena stood with me at the edge of the construction site, watching bulldozers move earth, beginning the long process of turning plans and promises into actual structure. My family came too. My father stood with Dylan, both of them wearing hard hats that Christine's team had provided, looking like they belonged on a construction site. My mother stayed near me, asking questions about timeline and unit distribution and whether I'd eaten lunch yet. When the speeches began, Christine surprised me by calling me up to the microphone. I hadn't prepared anything, but standing there looking at the empty lot that would become housing for 80 families, the words came easily. This project represents possibility, I said. Possibility that development and affordability don't have to be opposing forces. That we can build beautiful buildings that serve everyone, not just those who can afford market rate. That housing is a right, not a privilege, and that with commitment and collaboration, we can make that right real. I looked out at the small crowd, finding Elena's proud smile, my mother's teary eyes, my father's expression that might have been respect. This work isn't glamorous, I continued. It's complicated and frustrating, and sometimes it feels impossible. But it matters. Every family that gets stable housing matters. Every kid who doesn't have to change schools because their parents got evicted matters. Every person who can afford to stay in their community matters. The applause was genuine but sparse. Nothing like the acclaim my father's projects received at their unveiling. But standing there watching Earth move to make space for something that would shelter families who needed it, I felt something I'd been chasing for 8 years. Not validation exactly, but certainty. Certainty that I'd chosen right, that the work mattered, that the cost had been worth it. After the ceremony, my father approached me, his hard hat still on, looking slightly ridiculous and entirely earnest. That was a good speech, he said. You've become quite the advocate. I've always been an advocate, I replied, not unkindly. You just weren't listening. He nodded, accepting the correction. You're right. But I'm listening now, Marcus. And I'm proud of what you're building here. Thanks, Dad, I said, and meant it. We stood together watching the construction equipment, 2 men who built different things for different reasons but who maybe finally could see value in both approaches. The gulf between us hadn't disappeared, but it felt crossable now, like a distance that could be covered if we both kept walking toward each other. The work continued, demanding and difficult, and exactly what I'd signed up for. The building rose floor by floor, and with it rose the complicated infrastructure of making mixed-income housing actually work. There were setbacks and victories, frustrations and breakthroughs, the usual rhythm of any major project. But through it all, I carried something I hadn't had before. My family's respect, hard-won and imperfect but real. And more importantly, the knowledge that I'd been right all along. That the work mattered, that my choices had been sound, that building a life according to my own values rather than someone else's expectations was exactly what I was supposed to do. Years from now, families would live in these units I was helping create. Kids would do homework in bedrooms that were theirs, not shared with siblings in overcrowded apartments. Parents would sleep better knowing rent was tied to income, that they wouldn't face eviction if someone got sick or lost hours at work. That future justified everything, the family dinners I'd endured, the judgment I'd absorbed, the years of feeling invisible in the house where I grew up. I'd found my place, not despite my family but alongside them, doing work that mattered in ways they were finally beginning to understand. And standing at the construction site watching possibility take shape in concrete and steel, I knew that I'd choose this path again every time, no matter the cost. The truth doesn't always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it waits, patient and persistent, until the moment arrives when it can no longer be ignored. My truth had waited 8 years, carried silently through family dinners and dismissive comments, and the slow accumulation of judgment that never quite broke me. Now it stood visible in the form of a building rising from Portland soil, shelter for families who needed someone to fight for their right to stay. That was enough. That was everything. The building's completion came 18 months after groundbreaking, a timeline that felt both impossibly long and startlingly brief depending on which day you asked me. I'd aged in ways that had nothing to do with calendar pages, the kind of aging that comes from carrying responsibility for decisions that affect hundreds of lives. Every choice about materials or layouts or leaf structures rippled outward in ways I couldn't always predict, and the weight of that accumulated in my shoulders and in the lines that had started appearing around my eyes. The final walkthrough happened on a Tuesday morning in March, unseasonably warm for Portland, the kind of day that made people remember why they lived in the Pacific Northwest despite the rain. Christine met me in the lobby, which gleamed with polished concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. The building was beautiful in ways that transcended function, the kind of architecture that elevated rather than merely housed. Impressive, I said, running my hand along the smooth reception desk. You delivered on the design quality. Christine smiled, tired but satisfied. We had good motivation. Someone kept threatening to file complaints with the housing authority if we cut corners. That someone being me, I acknowledged. And I'd have followed through. I know, she said. That's why it worked. We toured the affordable units first, Christine watching my face carefully as I checked details we'd negotiated months ago. The kitchens had full-size appliances and enough counter space for actual meal preparation. The bathrooms had been fitted with grab bars that didn't announce themselves as accessibility features, but that would serve residents who needed them. The bedrooms were sized generously enough that families wouldn't feel cramped, windows positioned to maximize natural light. Every element we'd fought for was present and properly executed. In one unit, I stood at the window looking out over the neighborhood, imagining the family who'd soon call this space home. Maybe a single mother like Denise from Morrison Street, someone who'd been stretching every dollar to keep her kids fed and housed. Maybe a veteran like the other Marcus, someone who needed stability and support to rebuild a life trauma had shattered. Maybe an elderly couple being priced out of the neighborhood they'd lived in for decades, needing somewhere they could afford on fixed income. Whoever moved in here would have a foundation, a place secure enough to build from. That thought settled in my chest like a physical presence, heavy but welcome. This was real. This was happening. 80 families would have housing because of work that had started with that first contentious meeting in Christine's glass-walled office, because I'd refused to compromise on what mattered, because Elena had taught me to fight for details that seemed small but shaped entire lives. Your families start moving in next week, Christine said from behind me. Property management is ready. The community coordinator you hired seems competent. Jamal's excellent, I corrected. He's been doing this work longer than I have. Knows how to build community while respecting privacy. How to connect people with resources without making it feel like surveillance. Christine nodded, making notes on her tablet. We're planning a resident welcome event for 2 weeks after move-in. Nothing elaborate, just an opportunity for people to meet their neighbors, learn about building amenities. I'd like you there if you're available. I'll make it work, I promised. This is too important to miss. We finished the walkthrough and stood together in the lobby, the building humming with that particular energy of newness, everything fresh and untested. Outside, the street was waking up, coffee shops opening their doors, people walking dogs and pushing strollers and living ordinary lives. Soon this building would be part of that ordinary rhythm, its significance invisible to everyone except the families it sheltered. Thank you, I said to Christine, the words feeling inadequate for what I was trying to express. For pushing through when it would have been easier to give up. For treating this like it mattered even when you were frustrated with me. She looked surprised. Then her expression softened into something almost vulnerable. I didn't expect to say this, but working on this project changed how I think about development. Made me see aspects I'd been trained to ignore or minimize. You were right about a lot of things, Marcus. More than I wanted to admit. The acknowledgement meant something, coming from someone who existed fully in the world I'd rejected. Christine had built her career on market-rate luxury development, measuring success in profit margins and investor returns. But she'd been willing to learn, to adapt, to recognize that another way of measuring value was equally legitimate. My phone buzzed as I was leaving the building. A text from my mother asking if I was free for lunch. We'd been doing this more regularly now, these one-on-one meetings where we carefully rebuilt connection that had been strained nearly to breaking. It was still tentative sometimes, both of us navigating terrain without a clear map, but it was genuine in ways our relationship hadn't been for years. I met her at a bistro downtown, one of those places with good salads and natural light that made everyone look healthier than they were. She was already seated when I arrived, studying the menu with an intensity it didn't deserve, nervous energy radiating from her shoulders. The building's finished, I said once I'd sat down and ordered. Final walkthrough this morning. Families start moving in next week. Her face brightened with genuine pleasure. Marcus, that's wonderful. You must be so proud. I admitted. Exhausted and stressed about everything that could still go wrong, but proud. We ordered lunch and talked about logistics, the surface-level details that felt safe. But underneath ran a current of something else, questions my mother wanted to ask but wasn't sure she was allowed to. I recognized the hesitation. Had seen it develop over months of carefully reconstructed relationship. You can ask me things, I said finally, interrupting her description of some renovation project at the house. Whatever you're wondering about, just ask. She set down her water glass, her hands folding together on the table. Are you happy? She asked quietly. Really truly happy, not just satisfied with your work? The question was more complex than she probably realized, touching on dimensions of my life we'd never discussed. Was I happy? The work fulfilled me in ways nothing else could. Gave me purpose and meaning and the satisfaction of concrete impact. I had colleagues I respected and trusted. A career I'd built according to my own values. Tangible proof that my choices had been sound. But I was also lonely in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. The work consumed most of my time and energy, leaving little space for relationships that didn't directly connect to housing advocacy. I'd had a few brief relationships over the years, nothing that lasted, partly because I could never quite explain my life in ways that made sense to people who hadn't chosen similar paths. My apartment was still small and shabby. My car still held together with hope and duct tape. My wardrobe still pulled from thrift stores and clearance racks. I'm content, I said carefully. I believe in what I do and I'm good at it, and it makes a difference. That matters more to me than conventional happiness. My mother studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself, she said gently. Marcus, I'm not questioning your choices anymore. I'm genuinely asking if this life you've built brings you joy. The distinction surprised me, the recognition that she was asking not as a parent disappointed in her child's path, but as a mother worried about her son's well-being. Sometimes, I admitted. When a family gets housed and I see their relief. When a policy we fought for gets passed. When I can solve a problem that seemed impossible. Those moments bring joy. And the rest of the time, she prompted. The rest of the time I'm tired and frustrated and angry at systems that shouldn't be this hard to change. The rest of the time I'm drowning in paperwork and budget constraints and negotiations with people who see housing as investment opportunity, rather than human right. I paused, trying to articulate something I'd never said aloud. But Mom, that's true of any meaningful work. Dad gets frustrated with clients and budgets and construction delays. Dylan deals with difficult negotiations and impossible timelines. The difference is that when they're tired and frustrated, people don't question whether their entire career path was a mistake. She absorbed this, nodding slowly. You're right. And I'm sorry we added that weight to what was already difficult work. Sorry we made you defend choices that shouldn't have needed defending. We finished lunch talking about easier things, but her question lingered. Was I happy? Did it matter if the answer was complicated? I'd built a life that aligned with my values. Done work that changed systems and sheltered families, and created models other developments would follow. That should be enough. It was enough, I told myself, even as some small voice wondered what I'd sacrificed to get here. The first move-in day arrived with all the chaos I'd anticipated and some I hadn't. Jamal, our new community coordinator, had organized everything meticulously, creating schedules and systems that should have prevented bottlenecks. But reality never quite matched plans. And by noon we had 3 families waiting for keys while the property management office sorted out a computer glitch, 2 elevator outages because movers kept overloading them, and 1 minor flood when someone's washing machine hose hadn't been properly connected. I spent the day troubleshooting, running between floors with my phone constantly buzzing, solving problems that ranged from critical to absurd. By evening I was covered in sweat despite the cool weather, my voice hoarse from talking constantly, every muscle aching from carrying boxes and furniture, and the weight of making sure everything worked. But families were moving in. Kids were running through hallways with the particular joy that comes from having space to run. Parents were unpacking boxes and hanging pictures and beginning the process of turning apartments into homes. The building was waking up, filling with life and noise and the beautiful messiness of people starting fresh. Elena showed up around 6, carrying pizza and the kind of knowing smile that said she'd expected exactly this level of chaos. "You look terrible," she said cheerfully, handing me a box. "Thanks," I replied, too hungry to care about manners as I grabbed a slice. "It's been a day." We sat on the lobby stairs eating pizza while residents moved around us, the building humming with activity. "This is what success looks like," Elena said. "Not ribbon cuttings or awards, but people living their lives in stable housing." "I know," I said. "Doesn't make it less exhausting." She laughed, bumping her shoulder against mine. "You did good work here, Marcus. Better than good. This building is going to change lives for decades." The weight of that settled over me. Responsibility and pride mixing into something I couldn't quite name. Decades. People would live here, children would grow up here, families would build stability here. All because of decisions made in conference rooms and construction sites over the past 2 years. The impact stretched beyond anything I could see or measure, rippling forward into futures I'd never witness. My father showed up unexpectedly during the second week of move-ins, appearing in the lobby wearing casual clothes I'd rarely seen him in, jeans and a button-down instead of his usual suit. He looked around the space with an architect's eye, noting details and proportions, the way natural light moved through the lobby as the sun shifted. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, which we both knew was a lie. His office was across town, and nothing about his usual routine brought him to this neighborhood. But I let it pass, curious about why he'd really come. "Want a tour?" I offered, and he nodded. We walked through the building, me pointing out features we'd fought for and compromises we'd made. My father asking technical questions about structural systems and material choices. He was genuinely interested, I realized, not just performing interest to repair our relationship but actually curious about how mixed-income housing functioned architecturally. In one of the community spaces, a group of kids had gathered for an impromptu art session, their drawings covering every available surface. My father paused, watching them with an expression I couldn't read. "When I was building luxury developments," he said quietly, "I never thought about who lived there. They were clients, buyers, investment opportunities. Never just people trying to live their lives." He turned to me, his expression serious. "This building has people in it, Marcus. Real people whose names you know, whose stories you're part of. That's something I never achieved with my work, no matter how beautiful the design or how profitable the project." The admission hung between us, vulnerability my father rarely showed. "You provide housing too," I said, trying to be fair. "Different price point, but still housing." He shook his head. "I provide luxury lifestyle experiences wrapped in architectural packaging. It's not the same thing. What you've done here, creating affordable housing that doesn't feel like poverty management, that's architecture serving its highest purpose." We finished the tour in silence, both processing what had been said. At the entrance, my father paused, his hand on the door. "Dylan and I are working on a proposal," he said. "A development that would include significant affordable housing, using some of the models from this project. We'd like your input if you're willing." The request surprised me more than his unexpected visit had. Bennett and Associates asking for my expertise, treating me as a consultant rather than a wayward family member, represented a shift I hadn't seen coming. "Of course," I said. "Send me the details." After he left, I stood in the lobby watching residents come and go, people living ordinary lives in a building that represented everything I'd been working toward. My father's visit, his admission about the limitations of his work, his request for collaboration, all of it suggested something had fundamentally changed in how he saw me and what I did. But more than that, something had changed in how I saw him. He wasn't the enemy I'd sometimes cast him as in my head, the symbol of everything wrong with development and capitalism and systems that prioritize profit over people. He was just a person doing work he believed in, limited by the perspective he'd been trained in but capable of growth when confronted with alternatives. Maybe that was true for all of us. We worked within frameworks we'd inherited or chosen, seeing the world through lenses shaped by experience and values. The challenge was staying open enough to recognize when those lenses needed adjustment, when our way of seeing prevented us from understanding what others saw clearly. The resident welcome event happened on a Saturday afternoon, sunshine breaking through clouds in that tentative way that characterized Portland Springs. Jamal had organized everything beautifully, tables with food from local restaurants, activities for kids, information booths where residents could learn about community resources. The turnout was strong, People curious about their neighbors and eager to establish connections in this new space they shared. I circulated through the crowd, introducing myself to families I'd only known through applications and paperwork. There was the Nguyen family, their kids already friends with other children in the building, laughing with the kind of ease that suggested they'd found community. There was Denise's counterpart in this building, a nurse named Patricia who worked night shifts and was grateful for the soundproofing we'd insisted on so she could sleep during the day. There was James, not the same James from my early work but another veteran with similar struggles, talking animatedly with Jamal about the rooftop garden project they were planning. There were elderly couples and young families and single parents and individuals starting over, all of them woven together by the common thread of needing housing they could afford in a city that had become prohibitively expensive. Christine appeared beside me, watching the crowd with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "They look happy," she observed. "Like they belong here." "They do belong here," I said. "That was the whole point." She nodded, then pulled out her tablet, always working even at social events. "I wanted you to see something," she said, turning the screen toward me. "These are preliminary numbers on the first month. Rent collection is at 98%. Maintenance requests are actually lower than our market rate buildings. Community coordinator reports no major conflicts." The data confirmed what I'd hoped but hadn't dared assume, that given stable housing and proper support, low-income residents were just as responsible and community-minded as anyone else. The difference wasn't the people but the systems, whether those systems were designed to support success or to expect and prepare for failure. "I'm forwarding this to the city council members who were skeptical about the project," Christine said, "and to 3 other developers who've been watching how this experiment plays out." "It's not an experiment," I corrected. "It's just housing done right." She smiled, closing her tablet. "You're right. But for a lot of people in development, this still feels radical. Proving it works changes what's possible in future projects." The afternoon stretched into evening, the sun dropping toward the horizon in shades of orange and pink that made everything look softer and more hopeful than it probably was. I found myself on the rooftop terrace, away from the crowd, looking out over the neighborhood that had been transformed by this building's presence. Elena joined me, 2 beers in hand, offering one without comment. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city's lights begin to flicker on as darkness approached. Down below, the welcome event was winding down, residents heading back to their apartments, kids exhausted from running around, adults carrying leftover food and new friendships. "You thinking about the next project?" Elena asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Always," I admitted. "There's so much more to do." "There is," she agreed. "But Marcus, you also need to let yourself feel this. What you accomplished here is significant. Take a moment to recognize that before moving to the next crisis." Her words were gentle but firm, the voice of someone who'd learned through hard experience that burnout came from never allowing yourself to acknowledge victories. I took a breath, trying to follow her advice, to really feel the weight of what this building represented. 80 families housed, hundreds of lives stabilized, a model created that other developments would follow, policy implications that stretched beyond this single project, relationships rebuilt with family members who finally saw my work as valuable, proof, tangible and undeniable, that my choices had been right all along. The emotion hit unexpectedly, a wave that tightened my throat and blurred my vision. I'd been running on adrenaline and determination for so long that I'd forgotten how to feel anything besides urgency and exhaustion. But standing on that rooftop watching night fall over a building I'd helped create, I let myself feel it all. Pride and relief and satisfaction and grief for the years it had taken to get here. Elena's hand found my shoulder, squeezing once before letting go. "I know," she said quietly, and I believe she did. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Your father told me about the welcome event. How did it go?" I typed back slowly, trying to capture everything in a few words. "Better than I hoped. Families seem happy. Building feels alive." Her response came immediately. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. More than I can express." Simple words, but they landed with weight accumulated over years of hearing the opposite. I pocketed my phone and turned back to the city sprawling below, lights marking millions of individual lives being lived in the ordinary, spectacular way people always lived them. Somewhere in all that vastness were families I'd helped, people whose trajectories had shifted because someone fought for their right to stable housing. That was enough. That was everything. The work would continue, new projects and challenges and families needing help. But tonight, I could stand here and know that I'd done something real, built something that would last, proved that another way was possible if you were willing to fight for it. Elena and I headed back downstairs eventually, locking up the rooftop and making sure the last residents had what they needed. The building settled into its night rhythm, lights in windows marking homes where people felt secure enough to sleep without worrying about eviction notices or rent increases that would force them back into instability. Walking to my car, I passed the building's cornerstone, where a small plaque listed the project partners. My name was there among others, modest and official, marking my role without fanfare. I ran my fingers over the engraved letters, feeling the permanence of metal and stone. This would outlast me. Long after I'd moved on to other projects, other fights, other families needing help, this building would stand. Kids would grow up here, elderly people would age here, families would build lives here. And maybe decades from now, someone would notice that small plaque and wonder about the people who'd made this possible, who'd fought to create housing that served everyone rather than just those who could afford market rate. I hoped they'd understand it had been worth it. Every difficult conversation, every late night reviewing contracts, every moment of doubt and exhaustion and frustration. Worth it for the families sleeping securely in apartments they could afford. Worth it for the model we'd created that other developments would follow. Worth it for the small but significant dent we'd made in systems designed to keep people precarious. The drive home took me through neighborhoods at various stages of gentrification, where old apartment buildings stood next to new construction, where longtime residents mixed with newcomers, where the city's growth pressed against the needs of people who'd lived here for generations. The challenge stretched beyond any single building or project, but every unit of affordable housing we created was a small stand against displacement, a declaration that housing was a right worth fighting for. My apartment felt smaller than usual after spending the day in spacious new construction, but it was mine, paid for with work I believed in. I collapsed on my couch, too tired to even consider making dinner, scrolling through photos from the welcome event on my phone. Smiling faces, kids playing, families beginning to settle into a community that would hopefully support them through whatever challenges came next. A knock on my door surprised me. It was late for visitors, and I rarely had people over to this building anyway. Through the peephole I saw Dylan, looking uncertain in a way I wasn't used to seeing him. I opened the door and he held up 2 bags of takeout. Figured you probably hadn't eaten, he said. And I wanted to talk about Dad's project proposal. Thought we could do both. We ate Thai food sitting on my worn furniture, talking through Bennett and Associates' plan to incorporate affordable housing into a major development they had in the pipeline. Dylan had clearly done his research, asking informed questions about income qualifications and property management and community integration. He wasn't just going through motions to appease our father. He was genuinely trying to understand how to make it work. This matters to you, I observed watching him sketch out rough floor plans on a napkin. Does, he admitted. I've been thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving about whose work matters and what we're building for. Dad's projects are beautiful, Marcus. But they're also empty in a way I'm just starting to recognize. They serve people who already have everything they need. He set down the napkin, meeting my eyes. I want to build something that matters the way your work matters. Not instead of luxury development but alongside it. Something that serves people who actually need it. The conversation stretched past midnight, both of us energized by the possibilities of what Bennett and Associates could do if they genuinely committed to mixed-income development. Dylan had influence within the firm that I never would, access to resources and connections that could amplify impact beyond what nonprofit housing could achieve alone. When he finally left, promising to set up a meeting with their full development team, I felt something shift. My brother wasn't just supporting me anymore. He was joining the work in his own way, bringing his skills and resources to bear on problems I'd been fighting alone for years. The days that followed fell into new rhythms. The building's first month went smoother than anyone had predicted. Residents settling in, Jamal managing the inevitable conflicts and complications with skill I envied. Christine kept sending me data showing how well the mixed-income model was working, using it to convince other developers that affordable housing didn't have to mean reduced quality or compromised investment returns. My father's firm invited me to 3 strategy meetings about their affordable housing initiative, treating me as a consultant they valued rather than a family member they were humoring. The meetings were professional and productive, my expertise recognized in ways it never had been at family dinners. We disagreed sometimes, my advocacy instincts clashing with their development priorities, but the disagreements were respectful, two perspectives trying to find common ground. My mother started volunteering with a housing advocacy group, showing up to city council meetings and writing letters to legislators about affordable housing policy. She called me afterward with questions about zoning laws and funding mechanisms, genuinely trying to understand the systems I'd been navigating for years. It wasn't the relationship we'd had when I was young, but it was real in ways that earlier version never had been. 6 months after the building opened, I received an email from a family I'd helped years ago, one of my first successful placements when I was still learning how to navigate the housing system. Their daughter had graduated from high school, the first in her family to do so, and was heading to community college with plans to study nursing. The mother's email was simple but devastating in its gratitude, thanking me for giving them stability that had made her daughter's success possible. I sat at my desk reading that email over and over, letting it soak in. This was why the work mattered. Not just the immediate crisis solved, but the futures made possible by stability. That girl would become a nurse, would help other people, would build a life that would have been derailed if her family had faced eviction years ago. The impact rippled outward in ways I'd never fully see, touching lives I'd never meet, creating possibilities I'd never know about. Elena found me still sitting there an hour later, staring at my computer screen. "You okay?" she asked. I showed her the email and watched her face soften as she read it. "This is what we do it for," she said quietly. "These moments when you can see the impact clearly instead of just trusting it's happening." "The work's never finished," I said. "There's always another family, another crisis, another fight." "True," she agreed. "But Marcus, you've built something substantial here. The Morrison Street project, this building, the model you've created, the relationships you've rebuilt with your family. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." She was right, though it was hard to hold on to that truth when there were still hundreds of families on waiting lists, still policies that needed changing, still systems designed to keep people insecure. But maybe that was the real lesson I'd learned over 8 years of this work. You couldn't save everyone, couldn't solve everything, couldn't single-handedly fix broken systems. You could only do the work in front of you as well as possible and trust that it mattered even when you couldn't see the full impact. That evening I drove past the building on my way home, slowing to look at the windows lit with life. Somewhere in those apartments, families were eating dinner and helping with homework and watching television and living the ordinary miraculous lives that stable housing made possible. They didn't know my name, most of them, and they didn't need to. The work wasn't about recognition or gratitude. It was about creating the foundation that let people build their own futures. My phone rang as I pulled into my parking space. My father's name on the screen still surprised me sometimes, the ease with which we'd started communicating after years of careful distance. I answered, curious about what he needed at this hour. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying an excitement I rarely heard. "The city approved our development proposal. 80 affordable units in a 200-unit building. We start design development next month, and I want you involved from the beginning." The news should have felt triumphant, but instead it felt like confirmation of something I'd always known. The work would continue, expanding beyond what I could do alone, bringing in resources and perspectives that would amplify impact. My father's firm wasn't replacing what I did, but it was joining the effort in ways that mattered. "Congratulations, Dad," I said. "That's significant." "It's because of you," he replied simply. "What you built showed it was possible. Now we're taking it further." After we hung up, I sat in my car watching my apartment building, this shabby structure I'd called home for 8 years. I could afford better now, with the consulting fees I was earning and the grants our nonprofit had secured. But moving felt like abandoning something, admitting that the life I'd built here wasn't enough. Or maybe, a small voice suggested, it was about recognizing that I'd proven what needed proving and could now choose differently without it meaning I'd been wrong before. The work would continue regardless of where I lived or what I drove, or whether I could afford new clothes instead of thrift store finds. My worth wasn't tied to those external markers any more than it had ever been tied to my family's approval. I went upstairs to my apartment, small and shabby in mine, and sat on the couch I'd owned for 8 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families needing help, new policies to fight for, new developers to negotiate with. But tonight I could sit in the life I'd built, and know it had been worth every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But I'd done something real, built something that would last, proven that another way was possible. And somehow, along the way, I'd found my family again. Not by changing who I was, but by insisting they see me clearly. That was enough. That was everything. The rest would come as it always had, one family at a time, one project at a time, one small victory accumulating into something larger than any individual moment could capture. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.